after something was bought. Should you be bound by it? Does everybody see this? Clear? Now, here is where it gets tricky. Step saver, you have somebody who's buying software. It looks like they have an agreement and they go back and forth over the phone with TSI. Step saver will use that software to sell it to consumers, right? Provide the service to consumers. The software becomes faulty. The consumers suffer. The consumers sue Step saver. Step saver now sues TSI because it says you sold me faulty software. It looks like TSI and Step saver had a lot of back and forth. Step saver paid for TSI's software. They get the software back. There is a waiver or limitation on what?
Warranty?
Warranties. The warranty says we're only going to warranty what?
Before you open it?
The what? The physical, right? What is it that the warranty is limited? What does it limit it to? What? Anybody? Interesting fact.
So when the availability of the use of the program is to return a defective disk for replacement.
To return
For replacement.
defective disk.
Yes.
Does everybody see that? So, if you have a disk and the disk is defective, you can return the disk for what?
For
Replacement. But that means if the what? If the program is off, if any other thing is off, they are off the hook. This is not a disk that is broken. Does everybody see? So let's say you buy music. You get the disk. You plug it in, right? And you say it's Michael Jackson music. And it's not playing Michael Jackson music. It's saying zzz the whole time. What TSI could say is, that's not our problem. If you got the disk and it has a scratch on it, or it's broken, we can give you another disk. If you bought the disk from us, which included a program, you plug it in, and it's not the program, and it's completely gibberish, we are not liable. We waived all liability. This comes in the packet. Step saver says we should not be bound. TSI says you are bound. Does everybody see this? The court says we can't use 2073 to resolve the issue because we no longer have this last shot rule. What this is like what they call a terms coming later. It looks like you paid money for something, it arrives, and you notice that there are additional terms. Should those additional terms be enforced? The court tells you we're going to analyze it under this 2071. And what it tells you under 2071 is that a definite and seasonable expression of acceptance or written confirmation which is set within a reasonable time operates as an acceptance even though it states terms additional to or different from those offered or agreed upon, unless acceptance is expressly made conditional on assent to the additional or different terms. To understand what that is saying, you have to pause and assume that there is an offeror and somebody who's accepting the offer. And you got to ask yourself, who's accepting? In this case, the court considers step saver. Step saver, the buyer as the offeror. And what the court says, imagine that step saver said, I offer to buy your software, TSI. TSI says, I accept. When did this happen? When they shipped and agreed to ship the goods. They then propose additional terms. What 2071 tells you is that there is an acceptance. And it operates as an acceptance even though it states additional or different terms offered. So, if it looks like, and we consider it this way, that the buyer says, I want to buy this. I don't know about these additional terms that you have. I haven't seen them yet. I want to buy them, but I want to buy them on these terms, which is I want to use it and I think that you have a warranty. So they say I buy it, right? And the assumption is that the general warranties that apply to goods apply to it. That's a presumption. Unless you discuss otherwise, that's what the offeror is offering. I'll buy it. TSI says I accept. When they accept is when they agree to ship it to them. And when they pay the money, that looks like the transaction has been sort of consummated. Then when they get the additional terms, what the first part of 2071 is telling you is that those additional terms are not part of the agreement. They're not part of the agreement. You, the seller, have accepted the offeror's initial thing, right? Those additional terms that when they open the packet they see are not part of the agreement. They're only part of the agreement in one situation. Where it says, after the comma, we're engaging in statutory interpretation. This is difficult stuff. Right? It says, unless acceptance is expressly made conditional on assent to the additional or different terms. So what they're saying is, if you're a consumer, a buyer, you make an offer for something, the seller is the person accepting. They accept. They send additional terms. What 2071 is saying is that those additional terms presumptively are not part of the agreement. Unless the seller has made it clear to the buyer that they, the seller, will not go ahead with the transaction unless the additional terms are included. Does everybody see this? Presumptively not included unless the seller makes it clear to the buyer that they, the seller, will not go ahead with the transaction unless the additional terms are included. Notice that when you frame something this way, you have to pause for a moment. And one thing you have to say is that it doesn't seem obvious to you, but here's a problem with 2071, is that it sets up a presumption. It sets up presumption that those terms are not included. And then the second thing is that once you have a presumption, to overcome the presumption, you've got to ask who has the burden of proof. The burden of proof is on the seller. The seller has to show that they, the seller, will not have proceeded with the transaction unless the buyer accepted the additional terms. They should have conveyed that. What the court in Step Saver is saying is, hey TSI, this is the rule that governs you. You sent additional terms. Can you show me that you indicated to Step Saver that you will be unwilling to go with this transaction unless those additional terms are included? That's what almost all of this case is about. The court concludes in the end, we think you do not meet the burden. Does everybody now understand? We don't think you met that burden. Now the question is, why didn't they meet the burden? What is it that TSI failed to do? TSI said, we told you that if you didn't like it, you have to return it. That should have made it clear to you that we were unwilling to go ahead with transaction unless it were included. So they argued that. The court says, no, we don't buy it. Right? What is it that TSI failed to do? What is it? Why does the court say you haven't met this threshold?
The court have like 3 tests to test whether it is a kind of conditional acceptance manifestly. The first thing is that the offeree's response is a conditional acceptance to the extent it states the term materially altering the contractual obligation solely to the disadvantage of the offerer.
Right.
And the second approach consider acceptance conditional when certain keywords or phrases are used in such a written confirmation stating that the term of the confirmation are the only ones upon which we will accept the orders. And the third approach requires the offeree to demonstrate the unwillingness to proceed with the transaction unless the additional or different terms are included in the contract.
Right. And notice that what it concludes is that it's only going to go with the what? 3. If you look on page 425 of your book, it says TSL advances several reasons why the terms of the box top license should be incorporated into the parties' agreement under a 207 analysis. It says first, TSL said that parties was not formed until Stepsaver received the package, right? Second, TSL argues that the box top license was a conditional acceptance and what? Counteroffer under 207.1, which is that we made it clear to you that we're unwilling to proceed unless you took in these additional offers, right? Now, when you go into the next page on 426, the court says, TSL advances 2 reasons why its box top license should be considered a conditional acceptance. First, TSL argues that the express language includes the integration. Opening this product indicates your acceptance of these terms. The court says people say that all the time. It's generic. You need more evidence, right? Because a lot of people say that, and yet the additional terms are ignored. It says the second approach considers an accepting conditional when certain keywords and phrases are used, right? Right? Then look at the look at 428. It says the second provision provides a more substantial, right? It says TSL will refund the purchase price if the purchaser does not agree to the terms. And then you see what the court says. It says, even with such a refund term, however, the offeree may be relying on the purchaser investment and time, right? And that maybe that will prevent them from returning. Then if you turn to the top of page 429, this is where it gets really interesting. It says, but we need not consider whether such a refund offer could ever amount to a conditional acceptance. The undisputed evidence in this case demonstrates that the terms of the license were not sufficiently important that TSL would forget its sales. And then notice something that TSL did. This is all based upon evidence about what they did when they were negotiating the contract. It shows that Griebel testified that TSL assured him. Griebel is Stepsaver, right? It says, TSL repeatedly assured him that the box top license not applied to Stepsaver, as Stepsaver was not the end user of the multi-link advance program. Then TSL on 2 occasions asked Stepsaver to sign agreements that would put this formal terms between Stepsaver and TSL. That is, TSL said, we want you to sign an agreement making it clear that what? That we don't warranty these things. Does everybody see this? Outside, prior to the delivery of these products and whatnot, they said they had these discussions. Notice what the court is trying to say. If you had these discussions and Stepsaver refused to sign those agreements and you sent the stuff, it tells us that you were willing to send it, even if they didn't accept your additional terms. Because you already negotiated it before and they rejected the additional terms. That's the first thing. But there's even something even more damaging, right? It tells you that the box top license prohibits the transfer by Stepsaver of copies of the program. Does everybody see this? The box top license, the thing that comes afterwards, prohibits the transfer. Yet, they had an understanding before that they would be able to transfer it because the only reason why Step Saver is buying this is to transfer it to third parties. And the idea is, if these terms were so important to you that you were unwilling to go ahead with the transaction, part of the terms prevent them from transferring to third parties. And the whole reason why they were entering into this contract with you and paying you this amount of money is so that they could transfer to third parties, and you agreed. Therefore, this shows that these terms were not important to you, or so important that you're willing to forego the transaction. So you, TSL, have failed to meet your burden. You have the burden. You, the seller, have the burden. And you failed to meet it. Now, what does 207.1 govern? This is becoming very interesting. If you go to 207.2, it tells you that if the two people are merchants, one is a seller of goods, right, and deals with goods. The other is also a merchant who deals in buying and selling goods. That all those additional terms immediately become part of the contract. I think the people who designed 207 designed it so that we can have a whole section of an exam just on 207, because it allows you to go through multiple things. Go through 207.3, say, is this a form contract? Then you go to 207.1 and you say, well, did you insist on the additional term be included? Then you go to 207.2 and say, well, if both of you are merchants, the additional terms automatically become included. So if let's start with this, if TSL is a merchant and Step Saver is a merchant, and TSL says these additional terms are now being sent to you, between Step Saver and TSL, it automatically becomes part of the contract if they're both merchants. And some of you are going like, well, if that's true, aren't they both merchants? Yes, they are. So what happens? Well, there's a portion of this case that deals with 207.2, which we didn't show you. But you understand what I'm saying? So I just put that aside, right? They have to go through 207.1 first, exhaust 207.1, then they move to 207.2, then they ask the question, are you both merchants? And if you're both merchants, then it becomes included. Unless one of three exceptions apply. One, what is the first exception?
Expressly limits.
It expressly what? Limits acceptance to the terms of the offer. So if I made an offer to you and I said, when I first made the offer, I'm expressly limiting it, and you make additional things when you accept, those additional things will not be included. The second is if they materially alter it. If you send me an acceptance with additional terms and it materially alters the first one, the offer that I sent you, then they're not included. And someone will say, well, Professor, if they sent them an acceptance and their additional terms, those additional terms are not usually going to be consistent with the original offer, because if they were consistent, we wouldn't be fighting. So every additional term that is sent, that they're litigating over, is usually not going to be consistent. So what's the difference between inconsistent and material alteration? And I'll tell you, well, thousands and thousands and thousands and millions of dollars are litigated to separate that question. It's a very big issue, right? And material alteration, the courts have defined it as something like undoing the spirit of the original offer. And you can imagine undoing the substance and spirit of the original offer doesn't help you much. That's also litigated. Anyway, put the long story short, 207.23 is the most litigated part of 207.22 is the most litigated part of 207, because that material alteration language allows a lot of blurriness. 207.21, which is, did you make it expressly is easy to identify. You can look at your contract and say, did you make this clear that only the original terms are going to be accepted? 207.23 says notification of objection has already been given. That is, if you make the additional terms and include them, and I object to them, I, the original offeror, then they're not included. Otherwise, if you don't meet one of those three things, then those additional terms become part of the deal. Now, some of you are wondering, how did this play out in TSI? It turns out in TSI and Stepsaver, the court feels that TSI failed to meet 207.2 and 207.2.2 and maybe possibly 207.2.3, which is that there was coming a notice of objection and, right? So, but we don't get to that, but I just want to let you know, does everybody see how this transpires? So what this means is that in real life, if you have additional terms and you're a consumer that is not selling goods and a seller deals with you, 207.1 will apply. And you don't get to 207.2. If you are a merchant, you first go through 207.1, and after you exhaust 207.1, you move to 207.2. And when we meet next week, we're proceeding slowly through this for a reason. We'll discover that this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? Because Judge Easterbrook comes in and says, I can do something that allows us to skip over both 1 and 2 and ignore it completely, which is I can change who the offeror and offeree are. I can make the seller the offeror. And I can say that the buyer only accepts when they open up the box, look at the documents, and keep them. If I do it that way, there are never any later arriving terms. And you know what? If you're in a world that you accept Easterbrook, literally 207.1 and 2 disappear. They don't exist. And if you're in a world where you reject Easterbrook, you apply 207.1 and 2. How do you know which world you are in? You don't. So in an exam setting, you do all three. You go through, you look at it and say, what part of 207 applies? Then you look and you say, are these not merchants, or is one a consumer? Then you say 207.1 applies. And then if you look at both of them and one is a merchant, you go to 207.2. And by the time you're doing this, 45 minutes or 50 minutes have been burnt. And then after the end of all that, you say to yourself, but I don't know whether or not the court will reject the whole 207.1 apparatus and choose Easterbrook's rule. And if they do, they will apply 204 instead. And then you analyze it under 204. And if you're a lawyer, would you have to do that? Yes. And if you're a lawyer and you didn't do that, you'd be committing malpractice. So you would have to do that in an exam, if you would have to do that in real life. So we'll discuss the Easterbrook move. But I want you to read these things and see that you understand them. I'm trying to be slow. If you don't understand them, please come to office hours. Please talk to the TA. We got to nail this down. All right? So I'll see you next week.
说如果你是一个你不是商人，你是个普通人的话，你是
就不是当然就成立的，对，就是那个后来的就不是就是当然成立的，就是如果是商人的话，就是后来加进去就当然成立。
我知道，他那个他的条例是，他不是说如果是 merchants 就先 207.1， 然后再 207.2， 这个思想的那个流程，但是你不是 merchant 你就 207 几，
就到1就结束了，因为 2是指 govern， 两方都是 merchant。
那3呢
？3是不同的，对，不同的 part。3是解决那个你们在 negotiation 过程中的 battle of terms， 然后1和2是解决后面的 term。
对，就是后来的那个 term。
我觉得本来自己挺明白的，听他一讲乱七八糟。
我也觉得，我总觉得我看的案子跟他讲出来的案子不是一个案子。
对，他刚才说那个207.1的时候，我还是有点意外的讲的那个逻辑。他的意思就是说，你要表达，如果后边这个条款不加上的话，你就不继续来这个合同了呗。除非是这样，你这个条款才能被加进来，就特别绕这句话。就 2071的意思是说，你后面提供了一个 term 对吧？然后这个 term 是不是能放到我们这个合同里，是要看那个，如果不放到合同里，你是不是就不跟我继续做这交易了？如果是的话，咱们才能放到这个合同里。
那这个案子就是他后面叨叨了，就是他法院为什么不认为？因为他说页数我就懵逼，然后就是
我也是。
他说272有一段专门分析他的，但是这里面就把它省略了，点点那个是
为什么他就省略了呢？
因为1就能解决，就不用导。
不是，因为这是那个这个它会很长嘛，你见过一个 case 吗？好多页。他就他为了这个地方只讨论这一条，所以就省略掉了那一部分。
是说的不都
是因为1就能够解决他fail 掉了他的 burden 去来证明，如果这个条款不加进来，他就不做这个生意了，因为这个条款即使不就是两个原因，第一个原因是那个就是那个 stepper 下了这个订单之后，他还是卖了，然后还是给他发货了，这个就显示他自己要加进这个条款并没有那么重要。第二个就是他那个条款里边同时还包括一条 non-transfer 的条款，那个 non-transfer 的条款他是明知道这个是要卖给最终消费者的，他还做，那就说明这个条款不是就。这个条款即使不在，他也还是要做这单生意的。然后在同一个什么 box 那个什么 top license 里边，还有这个 non-transfer， 稍等一下 ，non-transfer 和那个和咱们要讨论的这条就是那 warranty 那条是在同一个 license 里边的，所以你 non-transfer 这个不是那么重要的，你那个就没有那么重要，是类比的。
所以他没有省略一段2人的那个说明。